"Remove this pauper from the table," my daughter-in-law said, as if she were asking someone to clear an empty plate. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Thought perhaps the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of polite conversation had twisted her words into something crueler than she intended. But then I saw the way she lifted her chin slightly, the subtle flick of her fingers toward the man standing near the doorway in a black suit. And I knew exactly what she meant. I knew it in the way the room went just a shade quieter, in the way a few guests suddenly became very interested in their wine, in the way my son Daniel kept his eyes fixed on his plate, as though the roasted salmon in front of him required his full attention, and I realized, with a clarity that felt almost gentle, that this had been planned long before I ever stepped into that dining room. I sat there for one more second, maybe two, long enough to feel the weight of every gaze that refused to meet mine, long enough to understand that no one at that table was going to speak up, not even the boy I had once carried on my hip through grocery stores, not even the man who used to call me every Sunday just to ask if I needed anything. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate, smoothing it with my fingertips as if I were finishing a perfectly ordinary meal. And then I stood up before the man in the black suit could take a single step toward me. I would not give them that. I would not let them escort me out like I didn't belong in a house I had once paid the mortgage on for over 25 years. The dining room was beautiful in a way that felt almost staged, a long walnut table polished to a mirror shine, candles flickering in tall glass holders, each place setting arranged with precise symmetry, the kind of setting that suggested warmth and family and celebration, and yet none of it felt real to me anymore. It felt like I had wandered onto a set where everyone else had already memorized their lines, and I was the only one who hadn't been given a script. Ashley didn't look at me again after that. She simply picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip, as if the matter had been resolved, as if removing me from the table was no more significant than adjusting the seating chart. And I found myself wondering, not for the first time, when exactly she had decided that I was something to be managed rather than someone to be respected. I walked past the guard without acknowledging him, my back straight, my steps measured, the soft carpet muffling any sound that might have betrayed the way my heart had begun to pound. No one called after me. No chair scraped back. No voice broke the careful illusion of civility they were all so determined to maintain. And as I reached the doorway, I allowed myself one brief glance back, just enough to see Daniel finally lift his head, just enough to catch the flicker of something in his expression that might have been discomfort or might have been nothing at all. And then I stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the table, the candles, the people who had decided, without ever saying it to my face until now, that I no longer belonged among them. And as the door closed softly behind me, I realized that what hurt the most was not the words she had used, not even the fact that she had summoned someone to remove me, but the quiet, practiced way everyone else had accepted it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I did not go back inside. I did not wait by the doorway hoping someone might come after me with an apology or even a weak excuse, because I already knew they would not. Instead, I walked slowly down the long hallway lined with framed photographs that told a version of our family that no longer existed. Pictures of birthdays and graduations and summer barbecues where Daniel used to stand beside me with his arm around my shoulders, smiling in a way that was open and unguarded, a version of him that felt like a stranger now. The soft lighting along the walls cast a warm glow over those images, but it only made the distance between then and now feel sharper, more defined. I paused briefly in front of one photograph taken nearly 15 years ago, Daniel in a simple button-down shirt, his hair not yet touched by gray, his expression proud as he held the keys to his first home, the home I had helped him buy with money I had spent decades saving, working extra hours, skipping small comforts so that he could have a strong start. And I remembered how he had hugged me that day, how he had said, "I could not have done this without you, Mom," his voice full of gratitude that felt genuine at the time. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, my fingers hovering just above the glass, not quite touching it, as if contact might shatter the illusion completely. Then I lowered my hand and continued toward the front entrance. The house felt different now. Not just quiet but hollow, like a place that had been carefully arranged to look like a home without actually being one. When I reached the foyer, I noticed my coat hanging neatly on the rack where I had placed it earlier that evening, everything exactly where it should be, as if nothing had happened at all. I slipped it on slowly, taking my time with each button, grounding myself in the small, deliberate movements. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected, a gentle breeze moving through the trees that lined the driveway. Carrying with it the faint scent of early spring, I stepped onto the stone path and closed the door behind me, the sound soft but final, and for the first time since I had left the table, I allowed myself to exhale fully, not in relief, but in acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted, that whatever place I had once held in that family had been quietly reassigned without my consent. I walked toward my car, parked a short distance away under a tall oak tree, its branches stretching wide above me like a silent witness. And as I reached for the handle, I realized how carefully this evening had been constructed, the guest list, the seating, the timing, even the presence of that man by the door. None of it had been spontaneous. None of it had been a moment of temper or misunderstanding. It had been a decision, a deliberate act designed to make a statement not just to me, but to everyone in that room. And perhaps the most unsettling part was how easily it had been accepted, how smoothly the evening would continue without me. As if my absence were simply another detail in the plan, I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I thought about the way Ashley had said that word, not with anger but with calm certainty, as if she truly believed it, as if she had already rewritten the story of who I was in relation to that family. And I understood then that this was not about a single dinner or a single insult. It was about something much larger, something that had been unfolding quietly over time while I had chosen to see only what I wanted to see. And as the engine finally turned over and the headlights cut through the darkness ahead, I made a quiet decision that I did not need to announce to anyone, not yet, because for the first time that night, I was no longer thinking about how they had treated me. I was thinking about what I would do next. The road home felt longer than it usually did. Even though the distance had not changed, the same 15-minute drive I had made countless times now stretched out in a way that made every traffic light feel deliberate, every turn more reflective than routine, and I kept my eyes on the road while my mind moved backward, not to the moment at the table, but to the hours before it, to the quiet anticipation I had felt while getting ready that afternoon. I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the soft blue dress I had chosen, one Daniel once told me made me look elegant without trying too hard. I had smiled at that memory then, smoothing the fabric at my waist, taking an extra moment with my hair even though there was no real need. Because I believed this evening mattered. I believed it was more than just dinner, that it was a chance to feel like part of something again. I had even brought a bottle of wine, one I had been saving for a special occasion, a small gesture, but one I thought would be appreciated. When I arrived earlier that evening, the house had already been full, voices drifting from the dining room, laughter that sounded warm from a distance, and for a brief moment, standing in the doorway, I had felt that familiar sense of belonging, the kind that comes from knowing you are expected, that your presence adds something meaningful. Ashley had greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that did not quite reach her eyes, and Daniel had hugged me quickly before being pulled into another conversation. Nothing overtly wrong. Nothing I could point to and say this is where it began. But there had been small things, subtle things. The way my coat was taken without a word of where it would be placed. The way my name was not mentioned when introductions were made to guests I had never met. The way my seat at the table had been positioned slightly farther from Daniel than I expected, as if I were an afterthought rather than a central part of the gathering. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into ordinary details, that families change and evolve, and I simply needed to adjust. But now, driving through the quiet streets with only the soft glow of streetlights guiding my way, those details began to settle into a pattern that was impossible to ignore, each one a small shift, a quiet repositioning that had been happening long before tonight. I thought about how often I had excused similar moments in the past. The missed invitations explained away as scheduling conflicts, the shorter phone calls attributed to busy lives, the decisions made without my input framed as efficiency, rather than exclusion, and I realized how willingly I had accepted those explanations because they were easier than confronting what they might mean. The truth had not arrived all at once. It had been building slowly, layer by layer, until tonight forced it into the open in a way that could no longer be softened or misunderstood. I turned onto my street, and slowed as I approached my house, the porch light casting a steady, welcoming glow that contrasted sharply with the carefully curated warmth I had just left behind. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, the engine idling quietly, and I thought about the difference between a place that looks like a home and a place that actually is one. And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that what I had experienced tonight was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of poor judgment, but the clearest expression yet of how I was now seen within that family, not as someone to be valued, but as someone to be managed, repositioned, and ultimately removed when it suited them. And as I finally turned off the engine and stepped out into the stillness of my own driveway, I understood that the evening had not taken something from me. It had revealed something I could no longer afford to ignore. I did not go inside right away after I stepped out of the car. Instead, I stood there for a moment on the driveway, the gravel shifting slightly beneath my shoes as I looked at the front of the house that had been mine for over 30 years, a house that had once been filled with noise and movement and the constant rhythm of a family growing together. And I found myself thinking about the years when everything had felt certain, when my role had been clear and unquestioned, when I was not someone standing on the outside trying to understand when the shift had happened, but someone at the center of it all. I remembered the mornings when Daniel was still young, the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and toast, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he rushed through breakfast, asking me questions about things that seemed so important to him then, school projects, friendships, dreams that changed from one week to the next. And I had listened to every word, not because I had to but because I wanted to, because being his mother was not just a responsibility, but something that shaped the way I saw the world. I remembered the years that followed, the long evenings spent helping him study, the quiet pride I felt when he graduated, the sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices because they were made with a purpose. I had worked extra shifts, saved carefully, planned for a future that I believed we were building together. And when he introduced Ashley into his life, I had welcomed her without hesitation. I had told myself that love meant making space, that families grow not by holding on too tightly, but by learning how to expand. I had invited her into this very house, into holidays and traditions that had taken decades to create. I had listened to her preferences, adjusted menus, changed small routines so she would feel comfortable, because that is what you do when you want someone to feel like they belong. There had been moments, even then, that did not quite fit, small pauses in conversation, decisions made quickly without including me, a tone in her voice that suggested something just beneath the surface. But I had dismissed those moments as differences in personality, as the natural adjustments that come with blending lives. I told myself that time would smooth those edges, that understanding would come if I simply remained patient. And for a while, it seemed to work. Visits were regular, conversations were easy enough, and I believed that whatever discomfort I occasionally felt was my own doing, a sign that I needed to adapt rather than question. Standing there in the quiet now, with the night stretching out around me and no voices to interrupt my thoughts, I could see how gradually things had changed, not in a single moment, but in a series of small, almost invisible shifts. The calls that became less frequent, the invitations that came later or not at all, the decisions that were presented to me after they had already been made, each one easy to overlook on its own, each one something I had explained away because it was simpler than asking why, and I realized that by the time tonight arrived, the outcome had already been set in motion long before anyone sat down at that table. I finally walked toward the front door, unlocking it with a steady hand, and as I stepped inside, the familiar stillness of my home greeted me, not empty but calm, not staged but real, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost grounding that everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made, every moment I had invested into that family had not disappeared. It had simply been taken for granted by people who no longer saw its value, and that realization did not break me the way I might have expected. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something steadier, a kind of awareness that would not fade by morning. The house was quiet in a way that felt honest, not the curated silence of a place designed to impress guests, but the natural stillness of a space that had nothing to prove. I set my keys down on the small wooden table by the door and walked into the kitchen, turning on a single light that cast a soft glow across the countertops. Everything exactly as I had left it that morning. A mug by the sink, a folded dish towel, small ordinary details that reminded me of a life that had been steady for a long time. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there for a moment, letting the coolness settle my thoughts. And as I did, something began to shift inside me. Not a surge of anger, not even sadness, but a kind of quiet clarity that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I moved into the living room and sat down in the chair near the window. The same chair I had sat in for years while reading, thinking, or simply watching the world outside change with the seasons, and I realized that tonight had not introduced anything new into my life. It had only confirmed what had been forming beneath the surface for a long time. I thought about the conversations I had overheard over the past year, small remarks that had seemed insignificant at the time. Ashley mentioning how complicated it was to manage certain family assets, Daniel agreeing with a distracted nod. The way financial discussions had gradually moved out of my hearing, decisions made behind closed doors and presented to me later as if they were already settled. I remembered the time I had asked about the rental property downtown, the one I had purchased decades ago, and Ashley had answered, before Daniel could, explaining that it was being handled and that I did not need to worry about the details anymore. I had accepted that explanation then, telling myself it was a sign that they wanted to take responsibility, that they were trying to ease my burden. But sitting there now, replaying those moments with a clearer perspective, I could see the pattern more distinctly, not just exclusion but control, a gradual repositioning that placed me further and further away from decisions that directly involved what I had built. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I considered the implications of that, not with panic but with careful attention, because if tonight had been planned, then it was not only about humiliation, it was about authority, about establishing who held power and who did not. And for the first time, I questioned not what they thought they had done, but what they believed they now possessed. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where a small desk sat against the wall, opening the top drawer and taking out a neatly organized folder that I had not needed to look at in months. Inside were documents I had kept carefully over the years, property deeds, account records, agreements that had been signed long before Ashley had entered the picture, long before Daniel had taken on the role he now seemed so comfortable in. I flipped through a few pages, not searching for anything specific, just reminding myself of what was there, of what had been put in place with intention and foresight. And as I did, that quiet clarity settled deeper, because the narrative they had created tonight, the one where I was no longer relevant, no longer central, did not align with the reality written in those pages. I closed the folder gently and placed it back in the drawer, not in haste, not in secrecy, but with a calm understanding that whatever came next would not be decided at a dinner table or by a signal from across the room. It would be decided here, in the quiet, where appearances did not matter and where the truth had been waiting all along for me to see it clearly. The night passed slowly, not because I could not sleep, but because I chose not to rush what my thoughts were beginning to reveal. I remained in the living room long after the lights in neighboring houses had gone out, the quiet around me uninterrupted, giving me space to examine each detail without distraction. And as I sat there, I began to connect something I had not fully allowed myself to consider before, not just the pattern of behavior, but the intention behind it. I thought about the conversations that had shifted over the past year, the way certain topics would pause when I entered a room, the way Ashley would smoothly redirect discussions whenever I asked direct questions, always polite, always composed, but consistently guiding the narrative away from anything that required transparency. I remembered a particular afternoon about 6 months ago, when I had stopped by unexpectedly and found Ashley on the phone in Daniel's study, her voice low but firm, speaking in a tone I had not heard from her before, confident, almost authoritative. She had ended the call quickly when she noticed me, offering a smile that came just a second too late, and when I had asked if everything was all right, she had assured me it was simply a routine matter, nothing I needed to concern myself with. At the time, I had accepted that answer, not because it satisfied me, but because I had not yet seen the full picture. Now that moment returned with a different weight. I stood up and walked back to the hallway desk, opening the drawer once more, this time with purpose. I took out a smaller envelope tucked beneath the main folder, one that contained correspondence I had received from a legal office nearly a year ago. I had read it then and filed it away, trusting that everything was proceeding as expected. But tonight, I unfolded the letter again and read it more carefully, paying attention to the language, the phrasing, the names included in the documentation, and I noticed something that had seemed minor before, but now stood out with quiet significance. Ashley's name appeared in a context that suggested involvement, not as an observer, but as someone participating in decisions that were not hers to make. I read the line twice, then a third time, not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because I wanted to be certain I understood it correctly. The implication was not loud, not dramatic, but it was clear. Enough. There had been steps taken, formal steps, that included her in matters that had always been mine. I folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment, considering not just what it said, but what it revealed about the past months, about the gradual shift from inclusion to quiet displacement. I returned the envelope to the drawer, but did not close it immediately. Instead, I rested my hand lightly on the edge, grounding myself in the realization that this was no longer about perception or interpretation. This was about documentation, about actions that had been recorded and structured in ways that extended beyond casual conversation or family dynamics. I closed the drawer slowly and straightened, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, and for the first time since leaving that dinner, I felt a sense of direction take hold, not rushed, not reactive, but steady and deliberate, because whatever they believed they had arranged, whatever position they thought they had secured, it had been built on an assumption that I would not look closely, that I would not question the details, that I would continue to accept what was presented to me without examining what lay beneath it. And as I turned off the light and prepared to move forward into the next morning, I understood that assumption would be the first thing to change. The next morning arrived without urgency, the sunlight filtering through the kitchen window in the same quiet way it always had. But something in me had shifted into a steadier rhythm. I moved through my usual routine without distraction, making coffee, setting a single plate at the table, each action deliberate, not because I was forcing calm, but because I no longer felt the need to rush ahead of my own thoughts. When I finished, I carried my cup into the living room and sat down with my phone, resting beside me, not checking messages, not expecting anything from anyone. And after a few moments, I picked it up and scrolled to a name I had not needed to call in quite some time. Robert Hayes, the attorney who had worked with me years ago when I first organized my estate. I had not spoken to him in over a year, but I knew he would still remember the details, not just of the documents, but of the intentions behind them. I let my finger rest on his name for a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice familiar, steady, unchanged. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke my name that reminded me I was still recognized somewhere exactly as I was, not reduced, not redefined. I did not explain everything at once. I did not recount the dinner or the words that had been spoken. Instead, I asked him a simple question, one that carried more weight than it seemed on the surface. I asked him to confirm the current status of everything we had arranged, every property, every account, every clause that had been put in place with careful thought years ago. There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but consideration, and then he began to speak, outlining the structure as it stood, explaining what remained unchanged, what required authorization, and what could not be altered without my direct involvement. I listened without interrupting, each detail settling into place, aligning with what I had begun to understand the night before. When he finished, I thanked him and asked if we could meet in person later that week. He agreed without question, and before ending the call, he added, almost as an afterthought but not without meaning, "If anything has been presented to you that does not match what we established, you should take a closer look." I assured him that I would, and after the call ended, I set the phone down gently on the table beside me, the room quiet once again, but no longer uncertain. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where nothing appeared different. Cars passing, neighbors moving through their own routines. Everything ordinary on the surface, and I realized that what had changed was not the world around me, but my position within it, not the place I held in legal documents or physical spaces, but the awareness I now carried with me, the understanding that whatever narrative had been constructed around me, whatever role had been quietly assigned, it did not replace the foundation that had already been laid. And as I turned away from the window, moving with a calm that felt grounded rather than forced. I knew that the next steps would not require confrontation or explanation. They would require precision, and that was something I had spent a lifetime learning how to maintain. By the time Thursday arrived, I had already decided what I would and would not say, not because I needed to rehearse, but because clarity had replaced uncertainty. I dressed simply that morning, a neutral blazer, low heels, nothing that called attention to itself, and when I arrived at Robert's office, the building looked exactly as I remembered it. Understated, professional, a place where decisions were made quietly but carried lasting weight. He greeted me in the lobby and led me into his office, where everything was arranged with the same precision I had always appreciated. Files stacked neatly, no excess, no distraction, and as I sat across from him, I placed my hands calmly in my lap and began not with emotion but with facts. I told him that certain actions may have been taken without my direct authorization, that I had reason to believe my involvement had been minimized in areas where it should have remained central. He listened without interrupting, his expression focused, occasionally making a note, and when I finished, he opened a folder on his desk and began to walk me through the current structure again, this time with more detail, pointing to specific clauses, explaining where authority remained exclusively mine, where shared oversight existed, and where no changes could legally occur without my explicit consent. Each explanation reinforced what I had already begun to understand, that while appearances may have shifted, the foundation had not. And when he paused, I asked him a single question: what would happen if someone attempted to act beyond the scope of what had been authorized? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder and looked at me directly. Then those actions would not hold, he said, his tone even, not dramatic, just precise, and any attempt to rely on them would collapse under review. I nodded once, not surprised, but confirmed, and then I asked him to prepare updated documentation, not to change the structure entirely, but to reinforce it, to ensure that every boundary was clear, every requirement unmistakable. He agreed without hesitation, outlining the steps that would need to be taken, the timelines, the formalities, all of it straightforward, all of it within my control. When the meeting ended, I stood, thanked him, and walked out of the office with the same measured pace I had carried in. But the difference was no longer internal, it was directional. I was not reacting to what had happened. I was moving forward with intention. Outside, the afternoon air was cool and steady, and as I walked toward my car, I thought briefly about the dinner, about the moment that had been designed to define me in a certain way, and I realized how small it now seemed compared to what I had just confirmed. Because while they had focused on appearances, on gestures and signals meant to establish control, they had overlooked something far more substantial, something that did not shift with perception or opinion. And as I opened my car door and sat behind the wheel, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement. Not of victory, but of understanding, because the next time we sat across from each other, whether at a table or in a room far more formal, the balance they believed they had secured would no longer exist in the way they expected. They invited me back the following Sunday as if nothing had happened, the message from Daniel arriving that morning with a casual tone that suggested routine rather than reconciliation. Dinner at 6. Hope you can make it. And I read it twice before setting my phone down, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what it was, not an apology, not even an acknowledgement, but an assumption that I would return to the same seat, accept the same unspoken terms, and allow the evening to unfold as though the previous one had been insignificant. I arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, dressed the same way I always had for family dinners, composed, understated, not performing, just present. The house looked identical to the week before, the same lights, the same carefully arranged table, the same quiet choreography of guests moving through conversations that seemed pleasant on the surface. Ashley greeted me with that same polished smile, her voice smooth, welcoming in a way that would have convinced anyone who had not been there before. Daniel gave me a brief hug, his expression neutral, as if nothing required explanation, and for a moment, I let it all settle, not reacting, not searching for anything, simply observing. I took my seat when it was offered, noticing that this time no one had positioned me at a distance, no subtle adjustments, no careful placements, just a chair, a place. As if the previous arrangement had never existed, conversation flowed Around the table, light, controlled, topics chosen for their safety, and I listened, occasionally responding, but mostly allowing the rhythm to continue without interruption, until there was a pause, a natural break where attention shifted, not dramatically, just enough, and I set my glass down gently before speaking, my voice calm, steady, not raised, not forced. I mentioned that I had met with Robert earlier in the week, that we had reviewed everything thoroughly, every document, every clause, every detail that had been established long before any recent changes had been suggested. The room did not fall silent immediately, but something shifted, a subtle tightening, a hesitation that moved. From one person to another, Ashley's expression remained composed, but there was a brief stillness in her posture. Daniel looked at me, really looked this time, not avoiding, not distracted, and I continued without altering my tone, explaining that everything remained exactly as it had been designed, that no authority had been transferred, no decisions finalized without my direct approval, and that any assumptions to the contrary would not hold under review. I did not accuse. I did not question. I simply stated what was true, and then I reached for my glass again, taking a small sip as if the conversation had not just shifted its entire foundation. No one responded immediately, not because they could not, but because there was nothing to correct, nothing to reinterpret. The structure they believed they had secured no longer existed in the way they understood it, and in that moment, I realized that nothing more needed to be said. I did not need to reclaim a seat or demand respect, because those things were not granted by words spoken across a table. They were defined by what stood behind them. And as the evening continued, quieter now, more careful, I remained exactly where I was, not as someone who had been allowed back, but as someone who had never actually been removed at all. They had called me something small, something dismissive, something meant to define my place. But they had mistaken visibility for value. And as I sat there, composed and certain, I understood that the difference between what they said and what was true was not something I needed to argue. It was something they would come to understand on their own, one decision at a time.